Eliot Ness was an American Prohibition agent, famous for his efforts to enforce Prohibition in Chicago, Illinois, and the leader of a famous team of law enforcement agents nicknamed the Untouchables. His co-authorship of a popular semi-fictionalized autobiography, The Untouchables, which was released shortly after his death, launched several television and motion picture portrayals that established Ness' posthumous fame as an incorruptible crime fighter. Early life. Eliot Ness was born on April 19, 1903, in Chicago, Illinois. He was the youngest of 6 children born to Peter Ness and Emma Ness. His parents, both of whom were Norwegian immigrants, operated a bakery. Ness attended Christian Fenger High School in Chicago. He was educated at the University of Chicago, where he was a member of the Sigma Alpha Epsilon fraternity, graduating in 1925 with a degree in economics. He began his career as an investigator for the Retail Credit Company of Atlanta. He was assigned to the Chicago territory, where he conducted background investigations for the purpose of credit information. He returned to the university to take a course in criminology, eventually earning a master's degree in the field. Career. In 1926, Ness' brother-in-law Alexander Jamie, an agent of the Bureau of Investigation, influenced Ness to enter law enforcement. He joined the U.S. Treasury Department in 1927, working with the 1,000-strong Bureau of Prohibition in Chicago. Following the election of President Herbert Hoover, U.S. Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon was specifically charged with bringing down gangster Al Capone. The federal government pursued his illegal activities in 2 areas: income tax evasion and violations of prohibition. Ness was chosen to head the operations under the National Prohibition Act, targeting the illegal breeds and supply routes of Capone. With Chicago's corrupted law enforcement agents endemic, in 1929 Ness went through the records of all prohibition agents to create a reliable team, initially of 50, later reduced to 15 and finally to just 11 men, called the Untouchables. Raids against illegal stills and breeze began immediately. Within 6 months Ness claimed to have seized breeze worth over $1 million. The main source of information for the raids was an extensive wiretapping operation. An attempt by Capone to bribe Ness agents was seized on by Ness for publicity, leading to the media nickname, the Untouchables. Quote, although Ness was not attacked, one of his close friends was killed. The efforts of Ness and his team brought major damage to Capone's operations. Ness' efforts eventually led the IRS to prosecute Capone for income tax evasion, according to Ness, although in reality, the Capone tax trial was a result solely of the research work done under the aegis of U.S. Attorney George E. Q. Johnson and IRS agent Frank Wilson, whose investigations led to Capone's downfall. In a number of federal jury cases in 1931, Capone was charged with 22 counts of tax evasion and also 5,000 violations of the Volstead Act. On October 17, 1931, Capone was convicted on 5 of the tax evasion charges after the Volstead Act violations were dropped. He was sentenced to 11 years in prison, and following a failed appeal, he began his sentence in 1932. 1931 to 1957, Ness was promoted to chief investigator of the Prohibition Bureau for Chicago and in 1934 for Ohio. Following the end of Prohibition in 1933, he was assigned as an alcohol tax agent in the Moonshine Mountains of southern Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee, and in 1934 he was transferred to Cleveland, Ohio. In December 1935, Cleveland Mayor Harold Burton hired him as the city's safety director, which put him in charge of both the police and fire departments. He headed a campaign to clean out police corruption and to modernize the fire department. In 1938, Ness' personal life was completely transformed while his career began to have some ups and downs. He concentrated heavily on his work, which may have contributed to the divorce that year from his first wife Edna. He declared war on the mob, and his primary targets included Big Angelo Leonardo, Little Angelo Sica, Medalits, John Angarala, George Anguissola, and Charles Polizzi. Ness was also safety director at the time of several grisly murders that occurred in the Cleveland area from 1935 to 1938 and made relatively small efforts during the investigations. Unfortunately, his otherwise remarkably successful career in Cleveland withered gradually. Cleveland critics targeted his divorce, his high-profile social drinking, and his conduct in a car accident, but he continued with the next mayor, Frank Lausch. Ness remarried in 1939 to illustrator Evelyn Michello. The Nesses moved to Washington, D.C. in 1942, where he worked for the federal government, directing the battle against prostitution in communities surrounding military bases, where venereal disease was a serious problem. Later he made a number of forays into the corporate world, all of which failed from his lack of business acumen. In 1944, he left to become chairman of the Diebold Corporation, a security-safe company based in Ohio. After his second divorce and third marriage, he ran unsuccessfully for mayor of Cleveland in 1947, after which he was expelled from Diebold in 1951. In the aftermath, Ness began drinking more heavily and spending his free time in bars telling stories of his law enforcement career. He also spent himself into debt. Ness was forced into taking various odd jobs to earn a living, including as an electronics parts wholesaler, a clerk in a bookstore, and selling frozen hamburger patties to restaurants. By 1953, he came to work for an upstart company called Guarantee Paper Corporation, which specialized in watermarking legal and official documents to prevent counterfeiting. Ness was offered a job because of his expertise in law enforcement. The company soon moved from Cleveland to the quiet rural town of Coudersport, Pennsylvania, where operating costs were lower. He made a decent income from GPC and moved with his wife and adopted son into a modest rental house. Once again, he enjoyed going to local bars and regaling amazed audiences with his tales of crime fighting. Later life, Al Capone promised Ness that two $1,000 notes would be on his desk every Monday morning if he turned a blind eye to Capone's bootlegging activities. Ness refused the bribe and in later years struggled with money. He died almost broke at the age of 54. Ness and his role in bringing down Al Capone had been completely forgotten at the time of his death in 1957, and no Chicago newspaper carried news of Ness' death. His heroic reputation only began with the posthumous publication of the 1957 book he had co-written with Oscar Frehley, and the 1959 and 1993 television series, 1987 film, and related media adapted from it. Personal life. Ness was married to Edna Staley (1929–1938), illustrator Evelyn Michello from 1939 to 1945, and artist Elizabeth Anderson Seaver from 1946 until his death in 1957. He also had an adopted son, Robert. Ness collapsed and died at his home in Coudersport, Pennsylvania of a massive heart attack on May 16, 1957. He was 54. His ashes were scattered in one of the small ponds on the grounds of Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland. He was survived by his widow, Elizabeth Anderson Seaver, and adopted son, Robert. Legacy. Archive. The Western Reserve Historical Society houses additional Ness papers, including a scrapbook, copies of newspaper clippings, a typewritten manuscript detailing Ness' career in Chicago, and miscellaneous papers, including a report on the Fidelity Check Corporation and Guarantee paper, of which Ness was president. Art, entertainment, and media. Numerous media works have been developed based on Eliot Ness' life and the legends surrounding his work in Chicago. The first of these resulted from Ness' collaboration with Oscar Fraley in Ness' last years to co-write the book The Untouchables, which was published a month after Ness' death and went on to sell 1.5 million copies. This book, among Fraley's other books about the Untouchables, was heavily spiced with fiction, including fictional characters and events, to make the books more appealing to a general audience. The 21-page manuscript that Ness wrote for the book was a more trustworthy source and only included the real events that Ness experienced during his career. His manuscript is housed in the archives of the Western Reserve Historical Society in Cleveland, Ohio. The book was adapted in multiple media and inspired many additional works. The best-known eponymous adaptations include The Untouchables, starring Robert Stack as Ness and narrated by Walter Winchell, and The Untouchables film by Brian De Palma, starring Kevin Costner as Ness and featuring Sean Connery and Robert De Niro. These two fictionalized portrayals, more than actual history, have inspired numerous novels. A second, short-lived, 1993 TV series titled The Untouchables, comic books, as well as references in animated cartoons, Tupac's California Love, and television shows such as The Simpsons episode Homer vs. the 18th Amendment and the Supernatural episode Time After Time. Ness was used in an episode of The Odd Couple and the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. Beer. Cleveland-based Great Lakes Brewing Company, which claims several connections to Ness, named an amber lager Eliot Ness, and included several subtle nods to his career in the beer description and label art. Proposed building naming on January 10, 2014. Illinois U.S. Senators proposed naming the headquarters of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives in Washington, D.C. after Ness. If approved, it would have been called the Eliot Ness ATF Building. However, Chicago Alderman Ed Burke and James Balser opposed the resolution in an article in the Chicago Tribune. In a news release, Burke said, Eliot Ness had a checkered career after leaving the federal government. I simply do not think his image matches the actual reality of his legacy.